Bert, Prins asks, what do you think about the effects of mutational load and its potential to destroy civilization? So, mutational load, I guess, refers to the fact that there's a backdrop of radiation in our environment that we can't avoid. Even if you live in a cave underground, there's still parts per million or billion or trillion of rare types like uranium. Living in a concrete structure like concrete has some kind of background radiation emanating from it, slightly radiated. It's not something that is going to kill you immediately. But everything, we're just surrounded. We're in a death trap here. So there's radiation everywhere. But that death trap also is what has produced life, in a sense. That because of mutations, we've been able to evolve. If there was no mutative property of life, we would be unable to adapt. Life would be unable to develop in the first place. So mutations are very important to the ultimate survival of life. What Bert is referring to is he says that since the Industrial Revolution, we haven't had any way of filtering bad mutations. And so mutational load refers to the way in which we're sort of like stacking mutations on top of mutations. And if you're a well-off, lucky person, maybe you don't have this problem. Maybe you don't have a mutational load. Maybe you're a very fit individual with respect to the environments of ancient times or even the Industrial Revolution. But a lot of people can look at themselves and say, oh, well, I've got this problem and that problem. And, you know, these ultimately... I mean, if you get hit by a bus, that's clearly environmental in some sense, although were you engaging in risky behaviors at the time? I don't know. But then there are other things which are clearly genetically influenced. When we talk about our psychology, when we talk about our physicality, a lot of issues can be traced to some kind of just random genetic mutation, or not necessarily even something that's random. There are a lot of, like, Tay-Sachs disease, for example, is a disease that is one of two bifurcations of a gene expression. That is, when you receive your two genes, copies of a gene from a parent, from your mom and your dad, or not necessarily copies, but you just get your different alleles and your different dominant and recessive, that if they combine in the right way, it's going to make you intelligent. But if they combine in the wrong way, recessive, then you're going to get Tay-Sachs disease. And there are other examples of that, where something can be harmful in an individual that's useful for a group genetically. But if we don't have any selective pressure in terms of how does family formation happen, or how do people have kids, who is having kids, what rate? This is essentially, in a way, it's a Malthusian problem. But instead of talking about limited food resources for a growing population, or fixed food for a growing population, we're talking about growing mutational load and some kind of imaginary limit where it's like, well, if we all have Down syndrome and we all have Tay-Sachs and we all have knocked knees and we all are, completely disabled, then there's not going to be anyone to take care of us. And I did get into it with Mr. Cool Mug. I was going to make it a separate video, but why not? I got into it with Mr. Cool Mug because he's very defensive of the elderly. He loves his elders. And he felt I was portraying them as parasites. Now, I don't actually know, because I talk so often. I sort of hit the record button, hit stop, and move on with my day. and I don't exactly memorize all the things that I said, to be quite honest with you. If I did refer to the elderly as parasites, that has a pretty derogatory negative connotation. But that word parasite, I don't know that it really has an objective equivalent other than a consumer, someone who takes, they extract more resources from society than they contribute to society. So in the cases of someone who's retired, 65 plus, they have major health problems, they have some kind of massive wealth that they're living off, they have Social Security that they're living off, and so they're clearly taking money out of the economy. They're clearly, in some senses, hoarding wealth and spending it on, patching up their decrepit and decaying bodies. And is that a benefit economically? I don't see how you get around that objective fact. Now, people can take issue with the word parasite. I did also want to get into that discussion of, while we're talking about mutational load, people who say, so go back to the example, let's say someone's in a wheelchair and you've got someone like Bert, Prince, or someone who's worried about mutational load, and they say, look at our society, we've got all these people who previously would have been eliminated from the gene pool, now they're allowed to live on and have kids. You sort of have to question there when someone uses the word like parasite, and again, maybe I don't recall either way. I'd have to look at a timestamp. I'd have to see context. But there's the objective fact of it, but then there's also the resentment. There's the resentment that I think working class and middle class feel toward those with disabilities, because they feel like, I think they feel a high-low versus the middle pressure. And I think it is important to get outside of this resentment at some point and to say people in wheelchairs are not going to collapse civilization. People with Down syndrome are generally nice people and are not going to collapse civilization. People with knocked knees are not going to collapse civilization. And one of the reasons why this is true is because, well, two factors. One is depopulation. The other is a shifting class structure and a shifting ecology of the economy. With regard to physical disabilities, we don't have as physical of an economy anymore. So it's just not accurate to say something like, well, look at all these people who are physically deformed, obese, and so on. That's going to collapse civilization. Not necessarily. And a lot of that has to do with the changing nature of warfare. I view the economy ultimately, at the end of the day, like, at some point, you have to have violence at the margins, right? So I'm not like anarchist, anarcho-communist. I'm not an anarcho-capitalist. I think that at some point, at some level, at some limit, like, in order to have decidability, in order to have consensus in a structure, you have to have physical limits to what people can and cannot do. We call those things laws, and eventually they have to be enforced by violence. If you don't enforce laws by violence at some point, because of random mutation, you're going to get people who rebel against your system, and if you don't use violence on the margins, your system will collapse. Our system does use violence on the margins, and I guess I'm just not these Malthusian problems of, the population's growing, we don't have enough resources. That's been a problem for a long time, and the elite recognize that, and the elite are not dumb, and they're not stupid, and I think everything that's happened between 2015 and 2020 has proven that. Because you look at what's been done with Donald Trump, you even look at what's been done with Bernie Sanders, the way in which these supposedly polarizing political figures are actually being used in many ways to subvert populist movements and to create a more moderate environment. Like Donald Trump has done more than I think any politician in American history to bring the sexual revolution to the Republican Party, to normalize gay marriage in the Republican Party. Obama couldn't do it. Obama could push it for the Democrats, he could push it for society at large, but a Democrat could never from the outside actually change the attitudes toward gay marriage within the Republican Party. Trump was able to accomplish that in a short 4 to 5 years since his campaign started, which is pretty amazing when you consider the rapidity of social change there. So we're looking at a lot of factors that contribute to depopulation. I didn't talk about this with respect to coronavirus too much, but there are comparisons that coronavirus acts like an STD, that it remains dormant in your system and then it reappears, sort of like if you have gonorrhea or one of these STDs that kind of goes off and on. It's active and it's dormant. And this coronavirus, people have been saying, and again, I don't know if it's true, but some people have said, well, it might lead to infertility. The Chinese government was taking a look into that. And so when out of Ohio, there's now numbers that are saying it could be as high as 100,000 cases in Ohio alone. When we're talking about those numbers, and we're saying that, well, only 1% of people are going to die, or maybe it's 4% or whatever it is. But even if it doesn't kill young people, and that's what the young people are saying, oh, well, it's not going to kill me, it's not going to kill me, it only kills old people. But maybe the unforeseen effect that it's literally going to take years of studies to determine this and confirm this, and at what rate, when a young person gets infected with coronavirus, what are their chances of being infertile or having a lowered sperm count for the rest of their lives? So that's a question we don't entirely know the answer to. And I'm not saying that it even is a thing for coronavirus. Actually, I've never heard of a flu that, caused you to be infertile. But if something like that was possible, maybe not with corona, but with some other coming pandemic, then what's the impact of that? It's massive depopulation. What's the impact of feminism? It's massive depopulation. What's the impact of sexual freedom in general? Massive depopulation. What's the impact of the fact that marriage has been made illegal, right? I can't create my own marital contract that says till death do us part. I can't do that. That's not legal. In the West, women have the right to divorce, which essentially means that traditional marriage has been outlawed. The idea that it's an oath to God, that you can't separate, and you just have to deal with it, whatever comes your way. When you do all these things, it results in a depression of fertility. The incel phenomenon is a way to try to explain that or describe that in a word. Of course, the word's inaccurate because simulated sex and virtual sex is more accessible than ever, and sexuality is more accessible than ever, and prostitution is more accessible, maybe not than ever, but it is pretty easy to go on an app and find a what do they call the Cash App, Premium, Snap, all these things. It's pretty easy to find a woman. You can pay, I don't know, $100, $200 or something. So incel is not really accurate, because if you can scrounge together $100, you can have the physical sex. But we're not talking about the physical sex. We're talking about intimate relationships, romantic relationships, stable relationships, all of the things that in Western society with monogamous norms are sort of necessary prerequisites to having kids. And even for those cultures and societies which do not have monogamous norms, they have very high rates of abortion, right? So abortion is not suppressing fertility, it's suppressing fecundity, it's suppressing the number of children that women raise to the age of maturity who can then themselves have children. So all these suppressions of birth rates and fertility, fecundity, that is what makes this mutational load not such a big problem, because again, it's ultimately just part of a class of problems that I would call Malthusian problems. And I think the elite understand Thomas Malthus, and they agree with Thomas Malthus, and that's why in pretty much every Western country since 1848, which is when we started to have these Marxist, socialist, anarchist, atheist, Republican, Democrat, in the traditional sense of those words, we had these revolutions in Europe. I think the elite sort of woke up and said, whoa, the masses are kind of dangerous. We need to get a handle on this. And since then, you've seen it from that angle, you've seen it from an elite angle, and you've also just seen it from, maybe you could tie it to the Enlightenment, the collapse of religion, you could tie it to Freemasons, you could tie it to a lot of people. Why is it that even you go back to 1750 in France is one of the earliest countries where this happens. You know, no coincidence that they had the French Revolution and all of that. They had this hyper-urbanism going on in France with Paris. A lot of trends that happen broadly now in the Western world really started in France. And for them, it's since like the 1750s that fertility and fecundity has been dropping. You know, before that, there's sort of a stable, steady state where women have like 8 kids per child, or excuse me, that was weird. 8 kids per woman. Women have 8 kids per woman. That's redundant, but there you go. They are at that stable, steady state for a while, historically speaking, and the death rate is decreasing, right? So the death rate is decreasing from maybe the time of the Black Plague. The death rate's decreasing slowly, and then faster and faster and faster. And as agriculture, as food becomes more abundant, and medicine becomes a little developed, and sanitation becomes a little bit developed, you see these massive improvements. You make marginal improvements in the beginning, and you get massive payback or reward in terms of lowering the death rate. So the death rate drops, and all of a sudden, you know, your kids aren't dying. 75% of your kids aren't dying. Then 50% of your kids. Then only 25% of the kids are dying. And so 8 children per woman. Before that was a stable population. Now that's an explosive population. That leads to a rise in urbanism. And I forget who brought up the rat experiment, who was asking me, you know, do you think this is true? Do you think it's accurate? Maybe it was Chatsey Cromwell. Maybe he brought up the rat experiment. The rat experiment where if you basically take an animal population like rats and you densely populate them in an ecology. So you take 1,000 rats and you throw them in a box. How do those rats behave? I'm exaggerating, but basically when the rats, even if they're well fed, right? It's not about starvation. It's just like all that we're saying here is that the rats are densely populated, and so their fertility and fecundity drops, and the male rats start acting like female rats. And there's also studies into birth control that say that when women are on birth control, they tend to prefer more feminine men. And I don't know what the corollary for men is. Maybe it's something having to do with porn use. Like if men use porn, they're more likely to report being bisexual, and they're more likely to prefer masculine women. I'm not sure what the corollary for men is, but I've heard I've at least heard for women that birth control makes them attracted to more feminine men, which you could view as again unraveling sort of the bifurcation of gender, which has been a traditional structure that undergirds Western families, Western family formation. So there's a lot of factors at play here. There's chemical factors, there's plastics and xenoestrogen, there's the rise of vegetable oils and the omega-3, omega-6 ratio and how that affects your insulin levels and how insulin is and fat production in the body is tied with your psychology. It all goes, that's a big gender roles topic. So there's a lot going on that is leading to depopulation, not just in the West, but as all of these Western norms and habits get exported to the third world, to Africa in particular. We're seeing a massive drop in African birth rates. The biggest declines in fertility are not coming from the Western world because the Western world is already below 2 children per woman. So it's like at some point with women, you know, you can tell them, oh, you don't need kids, and then they hit 30, 35, and they have sort of a midlife crisis or a quarter-life crisis. I don't know what you would say at this point. They have a fertility crisis. They realize, I'm going to have a child now or never, and so they become determined to have a child, despite having set themselves up for failure in that respect for their whole lives. And despite being set up like that by society their whole lives, they sort of have a crisis, and so they try to have that one child before they hit 40 or 35. So it's really hard, once you get women below 2 children per woman, it's really hard to cause fertility to decline very much below that, just because there's, in the same way that it's hard to make people like the smell of feces, and it's hard to, you know, make people unafraid of heights. Like, these are just like very basic, archaic structures in the mind that at some point you can suppress them to an extent, but to do that generally in the whole population, you sort of get a spring effect where you can think of the mind as like a coil, and you can push down on it and suppress it. But eventually, as you suppress it, as you push down on it, the force that it generates back upward becomes stronger and stronger and stronger. So, you know, you can suppress the reproductive urge in the 20s and in the early 30s, but by the time you hit 35, it's like the pressure is so great and so intense that it's very hard to have sufficient social engineering to completely remove the pushback that comes primarily from women who are like, I don't want to die without having at least one child. So it's hard to make gains in the West. Where the gains are happening are in Africa, where the birth rate is dropping from, 8 children per woman to 6 children per woman, and then it's going down to 4 children per woman. And you look at what's happened in Iran. Iran is now below replacement fertility, which I don't know if people understand the implications of that. If it can be done in Iran, it can be done anywhere. And when you look at African Americans, so Americans who are ultimately descended in part from Africans, they have below replacement fertility. You look at population projections, they're around 14 million. They're going to be staying at 14 million. The only reason they're going to slightly increase over the next century is because of African immigration. But without African immigration, African Americans themselves have below fertility replacement, or below replacement fertility. I'm really mixing up the words today. And that's just proof that this idea of RK selection, you sort of have to throw it out the window. It's not the most useful idea in the world. The idea that, little stupid people, mutants are having all these children, and the smart, beautiful, awesome, perfect people are not having kids. That's not actually accurate. That's not actually what's happening. If you break down fertility by Education. I've taken a look at the numbers, and I should probably bring them up again and really get them in my mind and start posting them everywhere. But PhDs have above replacement fertility. As you go down the list, professionals, bachelor, associates, high school degree, fertility decreases. And then people who do not have a high school degree have a bunch of kids. So there's sort of a horseshoe going on there. People who are very intelligent are having kids, and people who are well integrated into society, because of course I don't think, when we talk about mutational load, I don't think we can simply talk about intelligence. I think someone can be extremely intelligent and still be dysfunctional as a human being. Maybe they're narcissistic, maybe they're sociopathic, maybe they're depressed, maybe they're anxious, maybe they're antisocial, maybe they have autism, right? So there are a lot of very intelligent people who are not free from mutational load and are not entirely functional. So I don't think we can look at intelligence solely, which is why I think academia is actually a great way to look at it, and education, because education is not an intelligence test. It's not just, oh, the smartest people have the best grades and the smartest people have the highest level of education. No, it's how well you're integrated into society, how well you're able to game the system, play within the system's rules, cooperate with the system, accept the system, deal with the system. People who are not able to do that, it's not necessarily because of high mutational load. It could be just they have a rebellious spirit or very stubborn. But, people could say, oh, well, I know this PhD who's very dysfunctional. Well, we also have to ask the question, what is function? Because function has changed. Function is no longer about being strong and solid and beautiful and all these things. Function is how well you can deal with this environment. When people say things like, oh, you could never survive on a desert island in the middle of the ocean. It's like, yeah, what's your point? That is a type of resentment. That is a person who is adapted to a different environment, who realizes that their skills are no longer useful in this new environment, and they're angry and they're spiteful at the people who maybe are like quirky and liberal and whatever and weak and so on. They're angry and they're spiteful at those people who succeed in this new environment because they feel like they don't deserve to succeed, because they think there's some kind of objective value in being able to survive on a desert island, or being able to survive in the jungle, or winning a bodybuilding contest or something like that. So there's a conflict between ancestrally, instinctually, what we think to be good and valuable, and what is good and valuable in terms of succeeding in the current system that we have. So there's a lot of assumptions that go into this question of, do you think mutational load will cause the collapse of civilization? Let's turn that on its head. What if we ask this question? Do you think that our instincts and our stubbornness, our evolutionary stubbornness, and our inability to adapt to a new post-technological society, meaning that we've sort of, technology is no longer new, it's something we're integrated into, it's no longer something that's optional, you can't choose whether or not you want to live a technological life, it's something that you're forced into. We live in this post-industrial, post-technological society. Is civilization going to be able to survive? Or not civilization, because I think civilization will find a way, but individuals who are not able to adapt, will they survive? Right-wing people, will they survive? Masculine men, feminine women, will they survive? Bodybuilders, will they survive? These people who are highly adapted to previous environments, and they could survive on a desert island, they could survive in the jungle, and they have big muscles and brains that are developed for a majoritarian tribal society where consensus is clear and there's a clear hierarchy and there's no such thing as overabundance. People who are adapted to those environments, who often end up becoming obese because their bodies are so good at retaining energy, which is a good thing in a resource-scarce environment, but obviously not too great in a resource-abundant environment. Are those people going to survive? That's the question. I don't ask the question, is civilization going to survive? Because depopulation, when you look at it, it's hollowing out the middle. It's if you have a high school degree, if you have a college degree, you are going extinct. If you have a PhD or you have a third grade education and you dropped out of high school, at that point, then you have a chance to survive, right? There's a bifurcation of either you overcome some sort of threshold that's put up in front of the middle. You overcome, divorce rates. If you have a PhD, divorce rates are not too bad. You have an 80% chance of staying married, only 20% chance of getting divorced. If that was the general rate of divorce, we'd be thinking about a very different society right now. But by getting a PhD, you're able to overcome some of the blockers, fertility blockers, family formation blockers that are put up for people in the middle. And if you don't have a high school degree, you're at the point where nothing really matters and you're not concerned really so much about monogamy, and you're just having children because you're not intelligent enough to use contraception or something like that, or you're too high time preference. So the people in the middle are getting hollowed out because the people in the middle have basically evolved to be dependent upon religious and state structures to support their social behavior. Whereas the people on the top are the ones who create those structures, and the people on the bottom don't need those structures, don't have access to those structures. Things like monogamy were created by elites and enforced on the majority of the population, and so now the middle is sort of dependent upon monogamy. Monogamy is like a stable structure that holds up the middle, and you sweep that out from under them and they are collapsing, they are in free fall. So there's a massive depopulation going on around the world. It's not just the West, it's going around everywhere. Yes, at the moment, Africa's population is increasing because when you decrease the number of children from 8 children to women to 6 children per woman to 4 children per woman, the population is still going to quadruple in the next 100 years. But at the same time, once we end this century, fertility generally is going to be below replacement no matter where you go, whether it's Africa, America, Europe, Asia, it doesn't matter. And this process could accelerate in the same way that no one could foresee coronavirus. There might be other things that cause fertility to decline further that increase this rate, and actually the population projections, I think, are in some ways scaremongering when people say things like, Africa is going to have 4 billion people. Well, I think there's a chance that, first of all, if civilization collapses, the African population is going to collapse. Second of all, if civilization accelerates, if we become more technological, more post-industrial, and more overpopulated, then maybe fertility will collapse faster than we thought possible. And if there's something like the coronavirus, which does not kill people, think about this for a moment. We were essentially talking about a pneumonia-like or flu-like disease, which spreads as a respiratory infection, which spreads through the air and through contact, which kills 0% of people, which has a 0% death rate, and therefore there's no incentive for governments or really for anyone to take severe action or quarantining action against it. But instead of killing people, it has a 100% infertility rate. Consider that. Consider the effects of that, and consider the idea that an inoculation or a vaccine against it would cost $10,000. What effect would that have on the population? I mean, we could literally wipe out 90% of the global population by engineering a virus like that. And I just don't see any way that you can prevent that at this point. I don't see any way that people in general, if a laboratory owned by a government decides to release a virus like that, I don't see what you can do to prevent that other than, isolating yourself or having an isolated community. Those are really the only two ways out of that. But if you're just a person living in an urban, suburban environment, you go to a job, you go to work, you meet with people, you talk to people, there's really no way to prevent yourself from being the victim of that sort of thing. Now, we're not there, we're not at that point yet, at least not that we know. I mean, because again, if there was some sort of virus that had zero symptoms, all it did was cause infertility, well, what have we seen in the last 50 years? We've seen a massive drop in fertility. So who knows that that hasn't already happened? It would be sort of indetectable, right? Because if people aren't dying and people don't have any visual symptoms, there's no way to detect it. There's no reason to test for it. There's no reason to develop a test for it. There's no demand to identify it. People are just like, oh, fertility's dropping, sperm counts are dropping. Maybe that's just, and if I said fertility before, I meant to say sperm counts. Maybe that's the plastics, maybe that's psychological, maybe that's, and people come up with all kinds of, pesticides and chemicals in the water and antidepressants. So there's a whole host of reasons to explain that, but effectively, it's the ultimate consequence is no different from if a government released a virus that had zero symptoms, 0% death rate, but 100% sterilization, infertility, or just a cut in sperm count. So these are all very interesting ideas I think we have to consider when we talk about mutational load. And again, any Malthusian question, whether it's talking about mutational load or other resource-based questions, we have to take into the factor that fertility in the West has been declining for 3 centuries, and that the fertility is dropping all across the world. It's dropping in Africa. And if you're not considering that, if you're not bringing that into the discussion, then you get into these really weird predictions of the future that I don't think have entirely a basis in reality, because they're only looking at one side of the picture. They're only saying, oh, well, fertility's exploding. Well, okay, that's not actually true. Fertility is declining everywhere. The only place where fertility is increasing is when people get involved in hyper-religious cults. So when people convert to traditional Catholicism or something, that increases fertility. But of course, religiousness generally in society is declining. And if we could speak of a religiousness, we would speak of liberalism, which is one of the few religions that suppresses fertility generally, at least for the middle. So there are going to be these little cults of people like the Mormons and the Orthodox Jews and the Amish who have high fertility. And people who convert to those religions are going to see a boost in their fertility and their fecundity. But the vast majority are seeing a decrease. And what else can we say about this mutational load? I guess maybe to end it, the concept of resentment. I don't resent older people. I mean, I guess you could question that and say, well, you're just saying that, you're lying, clearly. The Mr. Coolmug argument was, if you call old people parasites, clearly you hate them, clearly you're an evil grandma hater, grandpa hater, which I don't feel I am, but, I guess that is what a grandpa hater would say, right? He would say, no, of course I don't hate grandpas, I'm just asking questions. Of course, I don't hate grandpas, I'm just stating objective facts. So, take that for what you will, but I don't know how you get around, if we're looking through a purely economic lens, I don't know how you get around the fact that old people indeed do not have jobs, they indeed do not contribute to the economy, but they indeed do take a lot of money out of the economy. I don't know how you get around that. And if that means that you have to hate your grandparents, I disagree. I don't think that just because you're recognizing some big economic fact, that means you hate your specific grandparents, or something like that, for people whose grandparents are not even alive. In that case, it's pretty hard to feel that resentment. But resentment is real, and people really there are intergenerational resentments, and there are also resentments again on mutational load. People in the middle who are being attacked resent the fact, and this is kind of an insecurity of social economic status. People are like, the middle class always feels the need to punch down on the working class. And so I see people who talk about social Darwinism and mutational load, and they're like, yeah, all these spiteful mutants below us. It's like, I mean, you can say that, but you're only looking at one vector of change. You're sort of assuming that what makes a civilization successful is a static thing, and that populations orbit around this centrality of what it means to be a successful civilization. But with massive changes in technology, I think the center of social behavior has changed, and behavior broadly, and what we mean to be a civilized person. I think those definitions are changing because our environment's changing, because technology is changing. And so I don't think we can say, all these people none of these people could survive on a desert island or a jungle, and therefore, the fact that we're seeing all these mutants, this word, I mean, it's another pejorative word, a derogatory word. Mutant has a negative connotation. You can't get around that. When you use that sort of word, it to me, it seems sort of like a cope. It seems sort of like a way to distract from the fact that really, if you're a middle class person, the world has changed in a way that makes your skills, your attitude, your mindset, your way of thinking, makes it not just unproductive, but counterproductive. And your inability to either, put yourself down in the dumps with the people who drop out of high school and pursue their strategy, or alternatively, your inability to advance into the higher ranks of the PhD class. For academia, it's the PhD. For the corporate world, it's the managerial class and upwards. For sports athletes, it's Division I. So whatever, once you reach that higher level, you sort of escape the problems of the middle to an extent, although the problems of the middle widen and widen. That's part of what we mean when we talk about income inequality, that the what we consider to be the middle class and the problems of the middle class are expanding and expanding and expanding. So it's no longer enough to, last year or a decade ago, it might have been enough to be in the top, 50%. Now you have to be in the top 60%, or 40%. And then in the next decade, you have to be in the top 30% in order to escape problems of crime, problems of family formation, problems that plague the middle. So, yeah, the resentment that people feel when I hear people talking about mutants and social Darwinism, and these people would have been taken out, they would have been selected out, and if we lived in the jungle, I would survive and all these people would die. Like, these kind of thoughts are very resentful, and to me, I think they reflect a frustration that people have with their inability to adapt, and when they look at people who are maladapted to previous times, but actually in some ways quite well adapted to our present state, they become resentful. They feel like this is not right, this is not just, this is not what is deserved. But ecology, and I'm not going to use the word nature because that word is sort of wrapped up in a naturalistic fallacy of like, technology is anti-nature. No, technology is part of nature. But to avoid that nature versus technology dichotomy, let's just talk about ecology. The ecology doesn't care whether you think the ecology is just. The ecology doesn't care whether you think the ecology is fair. The ecology doesn't care, about past ecologies. The ecology is in the here and now, and the ecology is saying, if you can't advance through the current social ranking system, you could even call it what do they have in China? The social points system. I forget the exact terminology, but if you can't advance through the ranks of society at this point, then you're going to be crushed. You're going to be hollowed out. You're going to be drowned by the maladies that are being directed toward the middle. So if you can't figure out a way to do that, then it's game over, right? So what do you do with that? How do you fix those problems? Those are the questions we should be asking, not like, how do we deal with all these mutants? That's not the right question. All right, that's it. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.